The call came in at 2:47 in the morning, and Nurse Avery Sinclair almost didn't answer it. She was 3 hours into a double shift at Mercy General, her sneakers still damp from the spilled IV bag she'd stepped into somewhere around midnight, her ponytail unraveling in ways that probably violated 6 hospital policies. The number on her phone screen was blocked. She answered anyway, because that's what you do when you're a nurse. You answer. You have something that belongs to me. The voice was low. Not loud, not threatening in any theatrical way. Just certain. The kind of certainty that doesn't need volume. Avery looked around the empty break room. Flickering fluorescent light, a half-eaten bag of pretzels on the table. Nothing that made sense of what she was hearing. "I think you have the wrong number," she said. "Avery Sinclair. ICU, 3rd floor. You were assigned to a patient tonight, a man admitted under the name Thomas Harlan." A pause. "That's not his real name." Her hand tightened on the phone. Thomas Harlan was in room 318. He'd been brought in 6 hours ago by 2 men in suits who'd paid cash at the front desk, which the billing coordinator had flagged and then quietly unflagged after a phone call Avery wasn't supposed to know about. The patient himself had a gunshot wound to the shoulder that someone had already half-treated, field-dressed. Her attending called it, which meant someone with medical training had worked on him before he ever hit the ER. He had no ID. He had a blood type that matched the paperwork. He had a tattoo on the inside of his left wrist that Avery had noticed and not written down, because something in her gut told her not to. "What do you want?" she said. "To make sure he doesn't disappear before I get there." The line went dead. Avery stood in the break room for a full 30 seconds, pretzel bag in hand, before she walked back to the nurse's station, picked up the chart for room 318, and did something she had never done in 4 years of nursing. She lied on a medical record. She changed the room number. She was 26 years old and had been practical her entire life. Grew up in Dayton, Ohio, daughter of a mechanic and a school librarian, the kind of household where you didn't waste food and you didn't waste feelings and you absolutely did not make decisions you couldn't explain out loud to a reasonable adult. She'd chosen nursing because it was stable and necessary, and she was good at it. Not romantically good, not calling from God good, just quietly, consistently competent. She could start an IV in the dark. She could read a patient's face the way other people read weather. She had good hands and bad luck with houseplants, and a 1-bedroom apartment that smelled faintly of the lavender candle she kept forgetting to blow out. She had no business interfering with whatever was happening in room 318. She did it anyway. The man in room 318, whose name was not Thomas Harlan, which she now knew with the particular certainty of someone who had been told so by a voice that didn't waste words, was awake when she came back in. This surprised her. The sedation she'd administered should have kept him under for another 2 hours. The fact that it hadn't told her either the dosage had been wrong, which wasn't possible because she'd checked it twice, or that his body processed medication at a rate that was not normal. That second option was more interesting, and also more alarming. His eyes were dark. Not brown, exactly. More like the color of old wood, something warm underneath something harder on the surface. He watched her cross the room without moving his head, which was either extreme self-control or extreme pain tolerance, or both. "You changed the chart," he said. Not a question. "Your IV needs to be checked," Avery said, because she was here to do her job and whatever else was happening could wait until she'd confirmed his fluid rate was correct. "Someone called you." She didn't answer. She'd checked the IV line, noted the rate, checked the pressure reading on the cuff attached to the wall. His blood pressure was better than it had any right to be for a man with a bullet wound and a mystery. Avery. She stopped. He hadn't said her name like a threat or like a question. He'd said it like a fact, like the period at the end of a sentence, and something about that landed differently than it should have. "How do you know my name?" she asked. "Your badge." She looked down. "Right. Of course. Who called you?" he asked. "I don't know. What did they say?" She hesitated for a fraction of a second too long, and he noticed. She could see it in the slight shift of his expression, the way his jaw set. They said you had something that belonged to them, she said, and that they were coming. He didn't react. That was what she'd remember later. Not fear, not urgency, not the kind of panic she'd have expected from a man who'd been shot and was now apparently being hunted to a hospital bed. Just a stillness. The kind of stillness that has mass to it, that fills a room. How long ago? Maybe 15 minutes. He looked at her for a long moment, and she had the uncomfortable sensation of being assessed very quickly and very accurately. "Why did you change the chart?" he asked. "I don't know," she said, which was honest. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile. Something adjacent to one, and maybe more unsettling for that. "My name is Cole Hargrove," he said. She would find out later, much later, in pieces, in ways that kept her awake for weeks, exactly who Cole Hargrove was. But that night she found out only what the next few hours required her to know, which was enough. He was 41 years old. He ran operations across 6 states that did not appear in any tax filing or corporate registry. He had 3 men dead in the last 2 weeks, and a 4th in federal custody, which meant someone was feeding information to people who should not have it, and that someone was close enough to know where he'd be on a Tuesday night in November. Close enough to put a bullet in him, and close enough to know which hospital the men who worked for him would consider safe enough to bring him to. He told her this in the same tone he might have used to read a grocery list. She stood at the foot of his bed and listened. "What do you want me to do?" she asked when he finished, because she was practical and the situation was what it was. "Nothing," he said. "Leave, end your shift. Go home, forget the chart. Someone is coming here, yes. And you're going to do what, exactly? You have a gunshot wound, a blood pressure cuff, and an IV line. I've managed with less." She believed him, which was its own kind of unsettling. "There are other patients on this floor," she said. He looked at her again with that assessing quality. 14, he said. "I counted the door intervals when they brought me in." She hadn't expected that. She didn't know why she hadn't. Everything else about him suggested the kind of attention that didn't miss things. But something about the specificity of it, 14, counted from a stretcher while bleeding, stopped her in a way that arguments hadn't. "If I help you," she said carefully, "I need to know the other patients are safe. They're not my target. That's not what I asked." "A beat, too." "They'll be safe," he said. She nodded once and started planning. What she had: a hospital layout she knew in her sleep, an employee badge with access to 3 floors and the service elevator, a supply cart, a set of scrubs in the staff locker room that were 2 sizes too big, and belonged to a travel nurse named Garrett, who wouldn't miss them until morning, and 4 years of navigating a building full of people who needed things from her all the time and had learned to look past her as a result. What she didn't have: any idea what she was doing or why she was doing it. She moved him at 3:20 in the morning when the ICU floor was at its quietest and the security rotation had just turned over. She'd been working this unit long enough to know the gap, the 7-minute window between Desk Officer Putnam finishing his round and the relief officer signing in. Cole Hargrove walked under his own power, which she'd told him was not advisable and which he'd done anyway. One hand on the wall and his jaw set in a way that suggested the pain was significant and entirely irrelevant to him. She put him in the dialysis prep room on the 2nd floor, which was scheduled to be empty until 6, and she stood outside the door and tried to remember if she'd had any clear reason to do any of this. She hadn't. There was a sound from the stairwell at the end of the hall, footsteps, more than one person, moving with purpose. Not the shuffle of a sick visitor or the quick pace of overnight staff. Something deliberate, something coordinated. Avery pushed the door open, stepped inside, and pulled it shut behind her. The room was small. Medical equipment along one wall. Cole sat on the edge of the procedure table, watching her with an expression she was starting to recognize. Not surprise exactly, just a recalibration, like a calculation being updated in real time. "You didn't leave," he said. "Obviously, I told you to. You also told me your name was Thomas Harlan." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the footsteps paused. She could hear voices. Low, consulting. The kind of conversation that happens when people are looking for something specific. "The door has a lock," Cole said very quietly. I know. It's also got a panel window. She moved to the supply cabinet, opened it, checked what was there. Saline bags, sterile tubing, a blood pressure kit, a spare Ivor-pole. They'll check every room, probably. So we don't wait for them to find us. He looked at her. What exactly are you proposing? She pulled the IV pole out of the cabinet. It was stainless steel, adjustable, about 5 feet tall, with a wheeled base and a hook at the top that she'd used to hang medication bags approximately 600 times. She handed it to him. I'm proposing we go out the back, she said. Service corridor connects to the loading dock. There's a security camera at the turn, but it's been on the fritz for 2 weeks. Maintenance has a ticket in, but nobody's fixed it yet. Cole looked at the IV pole in his hand. Something crossed his face that might, in a different context, have been appreciation. And if we run into someone, then you're a patient being transported for an emergency procedure, and I'm the nurse doing the transporting. She grabbed a wheelchair from the corner. There was always a wheelchair in a procedure room. She'd never been more grateful for institutional inefficiency, and set it in front of him. Sit down. You look like you're about to fall over. I'm not. I know. But you're also not going to argue with me about this because we have approximately 90 seconds before those men reach this hallway. He sat down. The loading dock was cold in the way that November in Chicago is cold. Not just temperature, but a kind of physical insistence. The wind off the lake coming around the corner of the building, like it had somewhere to be and you were in the way. Avery had grabbed her coat from the break room on the way through, which had cost them 40 seconds she'd spent bargaining with herself about, and which she did not regret once the air hit her. Cole was on his feet again. His color wasn't good. She was tracking his breathing the way she tracked patients, not consciously, just as a baseline, a thing she couldn't turn off. There'll be a car, he said. Where? North end of the lot. Black. They'll come when I call. He pulled a phone from somewhere. She hadn't known he had one, hadn't seen the men who'd brought him in leave him with anything, and made a call that lasted 4 seconds, and contained no words she could hear clearly except now, and what sounded like an address she didn't recognize. They waited in the shadow of the loading bay. A truck was parked at the far end, engine off, and somewhere above them a ventilation fan turned with a sound like a slow, tired argument. Avery's feet were cold. She focused on that, the physical reality of cold feet in damp sneakers, because it was easier than focusing on the rest of it. You grew up in Ohio, Cole said. She turned to look at him. How do you know that? Accent. Midwest, specifically Western Ohio. Columbus or Dayton. He paused. You iron your hospital badge lanyard. She looked down at the lanyard. She did iron it. She'd never thought about it as a tell for anything. You rid people, she said. It's useful. Is that how you knew I'd changed the chart? Before I told you? He didn't answer immediately. Across the lot, headlights came on. A black SUV, moving steadily, not fast enough to draw attention. You didn't report the call, he said. You changed the chart instead of flagging it. You came back alone. Yes, I knew. And that was, what? Trustworthy. Unusual, he said. People who are unusual in the right ways tend to be trustworthy. The SUV pulled up. The driver, a large man with the particular economy of movement that she was starting to understand, meant something specific about the kind of life Cole Hargrove lived, came around and opened the door without a word. Cole moved toward it, then stopped. He turned back to look at her. In the orange light of the parking lot lamp, with a shoulder wound and borrowed patience and a hospital gown he'd somehow made look like a choice rather than a circumstance, he looked at her the way he'd looked at her all night, like something being correctly identified. You should go back inside, he said. I know. They may have seen you on camera. The cameras on this side are the same vintage as the one in the corridor. Maintenance backlog. Something moved in his expression. You knew that before you brought us this ways. I told you about the broken camera at the turn. You didn't mention the ones on the dock. You didn't ask. The driver was very carefully not looking at either of them. Cole reached into the inside pocket of the jacket the driver had apparently brought in a bag in the back seat. She hadn't seen him put it on, but it was on now, a dark wool thing that probably cost more than her monthly rent, and he took out a card. Plain white, a phone number handwritten in ink that looked blue-black in the lot lighting. "If they come to you," he said, "call." She took the card. It was warm from his pocket. "That's not very reassuring," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's not." He got in the car. She stood at the edge of the loading dock until the SUV turned out of the lot and its taillights disappeared. And then she stood there another minute because the cold was real and the adrenaline was clearing, and she needed a moment to be just a person standing in a parking lot in November before she had to go back inside and be a nurse again. The card was in her coat pocket. She didn't look at it. She went back in. She didn't call. 3 days passed and nobody came to ask her about Thomas Harlan. The room had been cleaned and readmitted by morning. The billing record showed a discharge against medical advice at 4 a.m. signed. She checked once, with a feeling she didn't want to name, with a scrawl that looked nothing like Cole Hargrove's precise, controlled presence. Something had been handled. She didn't know what or how or by whom, and she decided, in the practical way that had carried her through 26 years of life, that she was not going to investigate. She worked her shifts. She ate lunch in the break room. She argued with a cardiologist about a potassium level, and was right, and he didn't acknowledge it, which was standard. She called her mother on Sunday and didn't mention anything about the previous Tuesday. She ironed her badge lanyard. On the 4th day, her supervisor called her into the office and said that a private medical foundation she'd never heard of had offered to fund her advanced practice nursing degree in full, no strings attached, starting in January, and asked if she wanted it. Avery sat with that for a moment. "No strings attached," she said. "That's what they said." She thought about a plain white card in her coat pocket, a phone number in blue-black ink. "I'll think about it," she said. She didn't take it. Not because she didn't need it. She did. She'd been deferring it for 2 years because the cost was impossible, but because she understood, with a clarity she found both irritating and clarifying, that she didn't want to owe anything. Not to a foundation. Not to a phone number. Not to dark eyes that read her like an address. She ran into him in a coffee shop. This was not coincidence. She knew it was not coincidence the moment she walked in and saw him at a corner table with a newspaper and a coffee and the jacket from the parking lot, and the moment he looked up and did not look surprised, because Cole Hargrove, she was learning, did not look surprised. Not because nothing surprised him, but because he had decided some time ago that surprise was not a useful expression. She could have left. She considered it for a full second. Then she ordered her coffee and walked over to his table and sat down across from him, because she was practical, and she was also, she was beginning to admit, curious in ways that weren't going to go away by avoiding the source of them. "The foundation was you," she said. "Good morning." "Don't, it was a thank you," he said. "Not an obligation. It felt like an obligation. Then you could have taken it anyway." She looked at him across the table. He looked well. Better color, holding himself differently, the shoulder apparently healing the way she'd hoped it would, based on the wound assessment she'd done at 3 a.m. in a hospital room, 2 floors up from where anyone was supposed to know he was. "You came back to my area of the city to have coffee," she said. "I came back to see if you'd called." "You could have just called me. I didn't have your number. You knew my name, my unit, and what state I grew up in before you'd been in a hospital room with me for 10 minutes. Something that was definitely closer to a smile this time. Fair point. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. The shop was busy. Morning rush, people moving through with the brisk purposefulness of people with places to be, and she felt, despite everything, strangely settled. Like the table was a fixed point. "The people who came to the hospital," she said, "did they? Handled. I don't want to know what that means." "I know." She thought about Dayton and nursing school and 4 years of doing the right thing in reasonable ways. She thought about a supply cabinet in the dark and an IV pole and a broken camera and a specific conscious choice to change a medical record for a man whose name she hadn't known yet. "What do you want?" she asked. Cole set his newspaper down. He looked at her the way he had in the parking lot, that clear, direct, taking account quality that she'd stopped finding unnerving sometime around the 4th day. "To know why you did it," he said. "Changed the chart. You've had 4 days. You must have an answer by now." She had thought about it. She'd thought about it at 4 a.m., and on her lunch breaks, and in the shower, and on Sunday while her mother talked about the neighbor's new fence. "You didn't look like someone who deserved to disappear," she said. "The people on the phone sounded like they wanted you to." It was not a complete answer. She knew it wasn't. But it was the truest one she had. And Cole Hargrove, whatever else he was, appeared to understand the difference between a true thing and a complete one. "Avery Sinclair," he said, and it was still the period at the end of a sentence. Still the fact rather than the question. But it was something else now, too, something she didn't have a clinical name for. "I know," she said, though he hadn't said anything else yet. Outside, the city moved through its morning with no knowledge of any of it. She learned things gradually, the way you learn most things that matter. She learned that the men who'd come to the hospital had been sent by someone inside Cole's own circle, someone who'd decided that a power shift was overdue and had made a calculated bet on his absence. She learned this not because Cole told her, but because she read people too, in her own way, and she paid attention to what he said and what he very specifically didn't say, and the shape of the silence around the things he didn't say. She learned that he moved through the city with a kind of visibility that most people in his position avoided. Not hiding, not costuming himself as something he wasn't. Just present in the way that very confident or very dangerous things are present, unhurried. She'd expected something more theatrical. She'd grown up on the same cultural vocabulary as everyone else. The private cars and the dark rooms and the men outside the door. There were men outside the door when she eventually had occasion to see that. But inside, it was quieter than she'd expected. She learned that he had read every issue of a particular academic journal on trauma surgery for the last 3 years, which explained things about the quality of the field dressing she'd noted when he came in. She learned that he was good at stillness in a way that most people aren't, that he could be in a room without performing his presence in it, and that this was rarer than she'd realized. She did not learn these things because she was falling into something. She was clear-eyed about that, about herself, about the nature of the situation. She was a practical person from Dayton, Ohio, who ironed her badge lanyard and had good hands and did not make decisions she couldn't explain to a reasonable adult. She learned them because she was curious, and because curiosity, she had always believed this, practically bone-deep, was the most reliable compass she had. The second time she changed something she shouldn't have, it wasn't a medical record. It was a name on a list. Cole had not asked her to. He didn't ask her for things, she was realizing. He told her things, facts, situations, and left the decisions entirely to her in a way she recognized as both respect and strategy and didn't particularly mind. She'd seen the list in a way that was adjacent to an accident. Not engineered, but not entirely accidental either, because she'd been paying attention for long enough to know that very little around Cole Hargrove was entirely accidental. The list was of people who had access to his location the night he was shot. Her name was on it. She understood why. She'd had access, she'd been there, she'd had opportunity. She understood the logic. She looked at her name, printed in someone else's neat handwriting on a document that would determine something significant about how the next few weeks unfolded, and she understood with crystalline practicality that her inclusion on it was a problem. Not because she was afraid of the conclusion. She knew what she'd done and hadn't done. Because 2 names above hers was a name she recognized, a man she'd seen in the hospital that night, not as a patient, not as a visitor, as one of the suits who'd paid cash at the front desk and made a phone call and unflagged the billing alert. He was on the list as an alibi. She took a photograph of the list with her phone. She didn't tell Cole. She thought about it for 20 minutes, which was all the time she gave herself for decisions that required moving, and then she made a phone call using the number on the plain white card. "The man who paid your admission at Mercy General," she said when Cole answered. "Morrow." A pause that lasted exactly as long as she'd expected. Not surprise, recalibration. "You've seen the list," he said. "He's on it twice, once as your staff, once as an alibi for the night you were shot. Same handwriting for both entries." Another pause. "How long have you known?" he asked. 20 minutes. I wanted to make sure I was right. "And are you?" "I'm a nurse," she said. "I check twice." He was quiet for a moment that felt specific. "You should have told me you were on the list," he said. "You should have told me I was on the list." A beat that was different from the others. "Yes," he said. It was not an apology. But it was Cole Hargrove, and she was learning what his words meant at their specific weights, and this one was close enough. She wasn't there for what happened next. She had no desire to be, and Cole had no intention of involving her, both of which she found, finally, reasonable. There were limits to practical, and she knew where hers were. What she knew was that Morrow was no longer a problem by the following Thursday. She knew this because Cole told her in the same tone he told her everything, factual and without decoration, over coffee at the same shop, same corner table. She didn't ask for details, he didn't offer them. What she knew was that the person on the other side of the list had been someone she'd have guessed eventually, if she'd had more information. Someone close. Someone who'd made a specific calculation about what the world would look like without Cole Hargrove in it, and had decided the math was in their favor. The math, as it turned out, had been wrong. She sat across from him at the table and thought about a hospital room at 3 a.m., and 14 doors counted from a stretcher and a phone call, with a voice that was certain the way only a few voices she'd ever heard were certain. "The foundation offer is still open," he said. "I know. It's a thank you. Not an obligation. You said that. You didn't take it." "No." He looked at her. "Why not?" She thought about it, genuinely thought about it, the way she thought about things, which was practically and completely, and without the performance of uncertainty she'd never had much use for. "Because if I take it from you," she said, "then every decision I make while I'm in that program has a different weight than it should." Cole looked at her for a long time. "You think very carefully about consequence," he said. "I'm a nurse. We're trained to." "No," he said. "Not like that." Outside the window, the city was doing what Chicago did in November. Grey sky pressing down on everything, people moving fast with their heads lowered against the cold, the lake invisible but present in the quality of the wind. Inside, the coffee was hot and the corner was quiet. "Avery," he said. Not a question, not a fact. Something else. Something with more weight than either. She looked at him across the table, and she thought about all the things she'd done that she couldn't entirely explain to a reasonable adult, and she thought that maybe that was all right. That being reasonable and being practical weren't always the same thing, and she'd spent long enough confusing them. "I know," she said again, and for the first time since the parking lot, Cole Hargrove smiled. Not adjacent to one, not something close to one, but the real thing, brief and unexpected, and somehow exactly what she'd thought it would look like. It turned out she had been paying attention to that too.